Of course not. Nobody ever does. Um, you start off just as I've said before, started off with what I hoped was going to be a slightly larger photographic studio in which we could do a production once a year. That was as small as it was. It was just arriving back here in Cape Town from London, when it suddenly started developing this sort of tidal wave effect. And even that sort of snuck up on us as person after person came in. Every day there was somebody new arriving to say, can I help? Can I do something? Initially, I was just looking for a bigger photographic studio, and everything came, but that changed very fast. Mainly, I think, because when Matric came in, Maciek Maszewski, the architect, he immediately got so enthusiastic about the whole idea that it just started bounding up with his enthusiasm, and it got bigger and bigger. I can still show you the buildings in Cape Town that we went in, and the designs that I hope Matric still got for all there were about 3 other buildings before we finally found the one. Never even began to thought of that. We just wanted to do theatre. We just knew there was a gap, and so we started off doing theatre. And I mean, one doesn't think of history, does one, when you're out there living it? It just is what's happening day to day. And, I think I get a little sort of rather wry laugh now looking at the poster for this one, which talks about the legendary space theatre, and you think, wow, remember all those nights when 5 people came? Difficult to think of it as the legendary space theatre, these plays which now people are talking about as really something, which played to hardly any people then when they first were performed. Yes, I think so. Not in it's always difficult. I spend a lot of time now because I teach young acting students, and I always say to them, theatre can change things because it's part of the system. I think theatre is part of a health system of a society. And the space was part of that, and therefore was part of the change. But if you look back and look at the things, statements after an arrest under the Immorality Act. The Immorality Act was was still being enforced when we did the play, but what was it, 10 years later, it was repealed. Sizwe Banzi is Dead was about the pass laws. It was something like 11, 12 years later, those were repealed. The Island was about Robben Island, and that is now being turned into, well, everywhere between a museum and a casino. It doesn't exist anymore. It's difficult not to think that what we did then had some effect in the overall plan of things, and was part of changing the consciousness of people, which is obviously what theatre is about, is about introducing a new perspective, making people think about issues. And so, yes, the space had a very direct effect on change, but it was one element of the things that finally became the huge change that has been South Africa. Well, that happened quite quickly. We started, as we've said before, not actually expecting that we were going to be able to be allowed to run as a mixed race theatre. And so we had in place when we started the Space Club, which was supposed to cope for the fact that we wanted to be able to present mixed race plays to mixed race audiences. But we obviously thought that the government would stop us immediately. We started running, and they didn't. Why they didn't is subject of a whole other area, and obviously I don't know why they didn't. Maybe they used us as a guinea pig. The play that I'm doing at the moment, The Geese, actually has a discussion on that, which seems almost to have been written by somebody associated with the space. It wasn't. It was written by a British audience. But we were used for something, obviously, otherwise they would have stopped us. And we just kept going. So much to our surprise, we were allowed to have our mixed race audiences. 1642 to 1660, the theatres were closed by Cromwell and the Puritans before the restoration of Charles II. And in that time, obviously theatre still flourished, and this playwright has written a play about it, a group attempting to survive in that period. When I first read it, I really did think that, he'd written about us. It was so close. We produced it in 1979. It was the third last play that we did. Everybody knew we were closing, and we did it, and it was banned after 4 days. Yes, when I was asked to come out and be part of this festival and suggest plays to do, it was one of the first ones. I thought, it got banned. It was about us. It's the ideal play to be doing, to actually see that play now in South Africa. It ran 4 days, yes. And then what happened is that it was banned on a Thursday. So we couldn't go ahead Thursday night. So we were in serious financial trouble, and we had to have something before the next play, which was in rehearsal, could start. So we got everybody that we could came in and started doing things. And what we did was that we were told by our legal advisors that we could not criticize the censor board. It's actually in the law. We could have ended up in jail. So instead we did a program which investigated what was available. We said in effect, sort of mea culpa, we are guilty. We are obviously guilty of offending against the law. The problem is we don't know why. So what we did is we set out to see what was allowed by the law, and in order to construct our program. And we gathered together the most incredibly awful bunch of material, which was allowed to be seen in magazines, on records, in cinema, novels, advertisements, those terrible detective, magazines, etc. The most appalling material we gathered together and put it up in segments and said, well, that didn't teach us much, but obviously we're still guilty. And then at the end of a very funny evening presenting all of these things, just before interval, the three actresses who were in the geese arrived on stage in the costume of a play that had played to about 500,000 South Africans, called Birds of Paradise. Birds of Paradise was just a play which the only merit it had, if that's called a merit, was having lots of women with hardly any clothes on. And it had been wildly popular and had never been banned. So these three girls got dressed up in nipple caps and cash sexes and walked onto the stage to enormous laughter. The audiences always thought it was terribly funny. And then each one of them made a statement as to how they felt about appearing in this costume and would feel about that sort of play, and how they felt about actually doing the geese. And it was extremely strong and used to absolutely quiet the audience down. It was very moving. I've actually got a very, very bad tape recording which has the three statements on it. You can just about hear these three girls, and it still is very moving 23, 24 years later. And then after the interval, we had a set of plays specially written by Geraldine Aaron, Dermot Judge, and I think there were two. They each wrote very short plays which were rehearsed. Now, all of this was done in 4 days. We reopened on a Tuesday with this program, in which we took famous sort of pornographic things like Sally's Train Journey, and then wrote plays which actually couldn't be banned, but the double entendre was immense, and the audiences enjoyed those enormously. We were very aware of that. In the early years, well, you were there. You remember the paranoia that reigned about just about everything. People were constantly sidling up to me at intervals and so on, saying, I think that man over there is a special branch person. It generally turned out to be a wonderful man called Mr. De Toy, who was a regular, came to everything we did, but he just happened to be terribly Afrikaner. He always carried a little briefcase and was dressed in a very neat suit. And everybody always thought he was a special branch, which he wasn't. At least, who knows, he may have been, but I don't think so. The decoy. But the others made themselves very plain and clear, the ones that were coming in. I think initially probably we were very carefully cased just to see exactly how dangerous we were. And when they realized that the basic interest we had in was theatre, They, as always, governments always make the mistake of thinking that theatre, to the most, is harmless. And it was only later that they would have discovered how harmful to them it had been. For instance, the censor board was constantly rather sympathetic to us in some ways, despite the fact that we always got banned. I mean, you were in a play, Occupations, by Trevor Griffiths, which was all about Gramsci, the famous Italian communist. And not only did it have that, but it had the element of nudity in it. And that played untouched for its entire run. I thought it was going to get banned when we did it. I thought this one doesn't stand a chance of lasting, and it did. And there were several other plays. And for instance, when we did Sam Shepard's Tooth of Crime, we did it at the University Theatre. And it has an enormous amount of very bad language in it and nudity. And they came and we got this very strange censorship document which said that we had to cut, and I won't say them here, but there was this list of, of swear words, and they listed them in a very po-faced manner, these 7 or 8 swear words, and we had a cut of many of them as possible. And I had to tell the actors, I don't know what as possible means, but see if you can cut 1 out of every 3. And of course, they didn't cut anything. And then there was an element of nudity in that, which Jackie Singer had to take off her top. And they said, no, she couldn't do that. She had to keep her bra on. And the really odd thing was that it changed a scene which was actually quite cold and chilling into a very erotic scene because she kept her bra on. It was really weird. They had censorship frequently has completely the opposite effect, and it certainly did then. Scarborough was never going to make it. It was a club production, so we never thought for a starter that they'd come and see it. And we did it knowing the dangers because it had male, female, and male sex, no, not graphically, and then, people taking their clothes off. So we actually didn't think that it would last if we opened it to a public audience. Unfortunately, and I think this exhibition has just reminded me of it, somewhere along the line, one of the newspapers got word that people had their clothes on and put it into one of our releases. And said that people were appearing without their clothes. And I think the censor board then felt that it had to do something about it, came along, saw it and banned it. Then there was the famous policeman that came and see it, saw it 3 or 4 times. Well, I personally never saw him, and I was in on every production there, but I was more worried about all the hay and straw around, which I thought we were going to cause a conflagration and burn people to pieces. So I was sitting there. There were, every night we had double the amount of stage management because I was terrified that we had live flame on stage, and Donald Howarth, who was a law unto himself, had brought in these huge bales of hay, and I just thought we are going to, incinerate our audience. So there were 4 or 5 of us sitting around with these fire extinguishers. But on the one night I was pointed out this man, and he really did look like a policeman, and he had his little thing, and somebody else said, this is the 2nd time he's come. And that was I know of 2 times, in other words, but other people said he came 3 times. Well, it was a good story. What the hell? A lot of good stories came out of this space. Some of the things I'm hearing now, I think, oh, well, it doesn't quite chime in with what I remember, but what the hell? It's a legend. Well, when you're living that close to survival in a way, it certainly concentrates the mind wonderfully. It's very exciting. If you speak to people who went through the Second World War, they'll say it's the most exciting part of their life because there was that danger all the time. And I think that it was what gave the space its edge, was this constant danger, day in, day out. Quite apart from the pure survival thing, you worked there. The salaries one earned were derisory. They were almost not worth earning. You one day, as I remember, came and gave your salary back and said, just let it keep the space going rather, because it's not worth much to me, which was wonderful. But there were other young actors, who actually had no other financial things, who were earning these teeny-weeny amounts and still managing to stay alive. And then, having the extra thing of knowing that the police might come in and stop you. And just the whole period of time was an extremely exciting one. especially the first area, 72 to about 74, 75. And then the other theatres opened up and things eased up a lot, so we didn't have quite that pressure on us. Yes, for black South Africans, the space was a security blanket, and it was a place you could go into and not worry. It was, as I said I think last night, in that Jean Naidu, who was constantly being hauled in by the security branch, had a phone tapped, spent several areas of time in solitary, when she was arrested. And towards the end of the space, in about 77, 78, came into me one day and said, I actually have got to stop coming here, because I come here because it's safe. I walk in here and I'm in another country, I'm in another world where I'm treated differently, I'm treated with respect, and it's actually taking me away from what's actually happening out there. So yes, it was a different experience for some people, a very good experience, but nonetheless different. Oh, I'm sure it does. Yes, it always does. Yes. I mean, I never thought about that at the beginning, but then after a while, you started seeing other people who were actually using it as what's the word? As a sort of a crutch, as a not even a crutch. Literally to do that, alleviating their own guilt. And then part of that, I finally left South Africa because I sat there and I'd watched other people go through this thing where they started making excuses for themselves, rationalizing what they were doing. And I didn't want that to happen to me. And the space could be used to do that, say, oh, well, we worked there and we did that. I mean, subsequently, for instance, in Britain, I used to find in programs statements by actors who had never worked at the space or with, say, Athol Fugard, saying that they had. Because it gave them such a sort of cachet overseas. They had this thing as though they'd been fighters. But a lot of people who'd never come near the place, and one or two who'd actually actively not joined us, were saying that sort of thing. We had black actors. There were a few black actors that stayed with us, but generally what happened when we found new black actors, which was really quite easy because the amount of talent, raw acting talent amongst black South Africans is extraordinary. I used to wonder where it came from until I realized that the whole of the culture is a narrative-based culture, orally passing down the culture so they're all totally used to the storytelling aspect. So it is no big deal for a black South African to be an actor because, a lot of their life has been inside that. So that there was this bottomless well. And what used to happen is they would come and do a play at the space, and the minute they'd had that first rush of that, they just leave for Johannesburg because that was where all the money was and lots of opportunities were. There were one or two, that stayed with us throughout through a long period of time. Toko and Chinga, Zwandile and Tsangani. They stayed with us for several years. There were others too, but mainly, it was almost a one or two play throughput. They would come in 2 plays, they'd be gone to Johannesburg, which one couldn't blame them because suddenly we weren't paying enough, even though for a black South African it was not a bad salary, but nonetheless in Johannesburg was Egoli, the city of gold, where you could really make it. If you were black South African, survival was terribly hard, so you used every possible way of doing that, and part of that was tapping into white liberal guilt, which was gigantic, and it used to amuse me no end watching how it happened, and how they would actually get all sorts of things out of people. That part of the process, I think, it doesn't just happen here. I think it happens everywhere. I see it happen in Britain with much poorer people and how they, inside my drama school, with students who come from a background where there is no money, and how they operate guilt on the ones that do have money. The whole point in that area, and I tried to establish that early, was that we were all human beings and we were all working towards exactly the same thing, and we all lived under the same circumstances. And then there were obviously certain allowances made. If you were rehearsing until 12:30, that meant that white actors would get into their car and go home, but black actors, you had to get home. So, you know, those were the one of the two, but they were always inside those realities. And yes, you know, I once had a big thing with Fats who attempted to operate that guilt thing on me, but I'm not Catholic or Jewish, and guilt doesn't work terribly well with me. You have to learn how to use it if you're in my position. I'm very good at operating guilt on other people. Fats was a poet, and Sue Clark had this circle of poets that used to operate, and Fats was one of them. When we did that initial fundraising epic at the Barn Theatre, and we're looking around for people, well, Fats told the story last night of how she'd had to fill in for somebody else who couldn't do that. I don't remember it that clearly, because it was an extraordinarily dense time for us as we were busy building the theatre and doing all sorts of things. And she did that absolutely extraordinary Madam Please, which was interesting watching her do again last night, because now she does it now with 25 years perspective. She did it then with a raw passion, which absolutely did blow everybody away. And she then came on. She just used to hang around and do things, and then one day I was talking to Sue about her, and I said, have you seen any of her longer writings? And she said, she's very good. And I said, do you think she'll make a playwright? And we always thought she'd make an actress after we'd seen her in that. So we started, we asked if she'd become a stage manager, just to sort of pull her into the surroundings. And she came in and was probably one of the worst stage managers we ever had, because it wasn't, you know, what she wanted to do. But we translated that quickly, and she started firstly acting, and then working with Robert Marta on the first play of us, the first South African. And then after that, you know, she was resident playwright for several years. Ah, yes. Well, there's an enormous amount of pain, bitterness, joy, anger. I mean, if you want to talk about emotions, the space just ran the gamut from A to Z and a half. And that was, well, that's part of it. That's part of life. If you're not prepared to go into those areas, then you're in the wrong place. I wouldn't even begin to want to talk about all the various bits of pain that came our way. We received a lot of very damaged people, who damaged by the society, people who actually couldn't cope with what the society was doing would come in there. And through those, I mean, I personally learned an enormous amount, because I had to cope with things that I'd never heard of before. Suicide complexes, people wanting to kill themselves because they were getting too much approval. It was a crash course in humanity. And we did have to nurse a lot of people through a lot of things all the time. There was always somebody trying desperately hard to cope with their pain in one way or another, generally through booze and drugs, trying to anesthetize themselves. And last night there again we had one more person in that state. Yvonne had a really ambiguous relationship to the space. From the beginning, you know, she and Athol were sat in London and really did listen, as I said last night, the sort of rather kindly patronizing, yes, wouldn't it be wonderful, wouldn't it be wonderful? Because they'd heard that story a million times, never actually thinking that we were going to do it. And then when it became reality, she threw herself into it when she could actually have been elsewhere. And really committed herself to doing it. She constantly had a problem, because in certain terms, as I'm sure you must have found, when the actors who were further down the line were constantly rubbing up against very, very new actors who'd just come out of drama school. And there was constantly, the new young actors had a sort of an arrogance about the older actors, which was always, there was always a slight rubbing point there. And what would happen is that Yvonne would go away overseas, do something at the Royal Court or, you know, at the Riverside in London, and then come back. And every time she came back, there'd been this sort of slight standoffishness which she had to cope with, which caused her quite a few problems. But she always managed to handle one way or the other, because she was the perfect company person. And she didn't have that sort of sense of a huge I am the big actor. As I have to say, Percy, neither did you. And that really helped enormously in order to keep her going inside that. But towards the end, she was actually getting quite resentful of the amount of time that it took me away, because it was sort of 10 a.m. to 11 p.m. daily, and that frequently included Sundays. And she was starting to get very nervy about that amount of time. But the amount of work she did, well, just looking at the exhibitions, sometimes you forgot quite how much it was, you know. And the space obviously was as good for her as she was for the space, but every time she came, you know, the audiences came too. So there was no way we could, the space could have actually survived without her. It would have fallen to pieces quite a lot earlier, because she had a very, very loyal following who would come and see literally anything she was in. It was not an arrogance it was an arrogance based on a sort of fear of what might come from that, because, you know, one has to say that there are actors that actually do treat younger actors with extreme disrespect. And as I say, it was always just an initial thing which you fought away past, and then they would all get on as though they were the oldest friends ever, which is what she was good at.
It's evident, I mean, in the tributes that we received
Yes.
from these young actors,
Yeah.
all of them
Yes.
mentioned the experiences that they had with working
Yes.
with Athol and others.
Yes. Well, she was a great actress, and it's difficult to talk about her as a husband, because I lived with that all the time. But it was just what she taught me was gigantic. The memories she's left me are wonderful and sweet and painful and everything. It was a major area of my life, and the space, our relationship inside the space, was also equally major, and it had its ups and downs.
You know, now, 25 years later, we can see the impact the space made, not only on society in South Africa, but also abroad. Can you maybe just tell us about people and productions that moved out to the rest of the world, and what effect that has?
I think what the space did for people overall was teach them how little was required to do good theatre. Because we never had any money, we never had the big bother of gigantic sets because we couldn't afford them. We never had the bother of amazing costumes because we couldn't afford them. Everything was done at a basic minimum, and the people that were trained in that system came out of it really requiring very little. They didn't require all the props that you get given in bigger theatres. That sent them out with a sort of rather spare approach to theatre, but also an approach to theatre where the major element that you're dealing with is the play, the script, and what it's saying, what effect it will have on the audience. For most of them, came out of it with a lack of vanity about what they were doing, because constantly the play and what it was saying was larger than the actor and what they were doing. And nobody ever went around sort of falling on their knees in front of the actors, bowing and scraping. They were treated like everybody else. And they personally had a very strong approach, which we could see last night. You know, there's still actors overall, all of the ones that came, still have that very sharp focus on what's important and what's not important. And I think a lot of people in theatre which doesn't have quite such a strong connection to its community, and the space had a very strong connection to its community. You had audiences that would come in and talk back. They would criticize. They would phone the following day and say, why are you doing this play? They were an audience that was alive, and I think that helped enormously. It was a gigantically good training ground for people. And you can still see the ones that have held on to that training. Sometimes it's taken years. Some of the actors who I despaired of at the time, years later are suddenly starting to produce work which you know is rooted in what their experiences were. At the thing last night, somebody, I won't say who she was, but said hello to me at the beginning, an actress that had worked with us for 2 years and done really good work. And towards the end of the program, she came around, looked at me and said, I've only just realized what it meant to me. Now, she worked with us 23 years ago. I've only just realized what it meant to me. And I just looked at it and thought, it's going to be interesting to see where you go now, having come to that realization.
As you say, I mean, people were using the space in their CVs to
Yes.
who didn't even work at the space.
Mm.
But the space, there was a reason for that, because the space was so well known abroad.
Yes.
Where space plays were done all over the world.
Well, apart from Sizwe Banzi, the island statements, which were done just about everywhere, Bar and Joe, which Geraldine Aaron wrote, I've just left London. There was a production going in London, and yet again, as I left, I spoke to Geraldine, who's living there, and she was busy hunting down some Irish group that had done the play and then not paid her royalties. It's had 300-400 productions around the world, that play, and then various of the other ones, just gone on, and the playwrights have started working. Fats has had a new play, which I've just saw the copy of the other day for the first time. Yes, it did spread itself around the world. When you operate, I went to see Richard E. Grant about, his contribution, and he was at the space in 2 plays. He just did 2 plays, then he did a lot of work at the People's Space. But also I knew him then as a young student, and he was a regular audience at the Space Plays. And just sitting down and, I thought, a big film star, he won't have terribly much time for me now. But in fact, he actually spoke to me for about an hour and a half, and he kept saying, what about, and who's there, and what, and remember this one. And he had all of these memories coming from that, which are obviously still rather important to him. The space really did settle itself in people's psyches, and I think the space provided for people a touchstone of truth, which they could hang on to in the rest of their life, constantly going back and comparing against it, saying, this is what it was like. I remember the sound of truth. And so that subsequently everything you say is measured against that sound, that vibration. It was always a problem with the space. We had this thing where the Reserve Bank was not our greatest friend, and we had to send our money out, and we always made our decisions very late, and they changed the laws so that you actually had to apply very early. So we had a lot of problems, and fortunately for us, we had very, very good friends overseas amongst agents who were incredibly long-suffering, and playwrights who would just sort of defer and defer. And some of them actually never got their royalties finally. There was a time which came towards the end when one day I was confronted with a thing that I had to send royalties off on a production, but I also had a set of actors, and they were predominantly black, that I had to pay. And I just thought, I'm sorry, this playwright who is not dying of hunger at the moment is just going to have to give in to this playwright, this bunch of actors who are, and went with that. So, John Herbert, who wrote Fortune and Men's Eyes, actually, we were about to send him his royalties, and he wrote us a letter saying, look, we'd sent him photographs, and he said it looked wonderful. He said, keep the royalties, do something good with it. And we did. We hired Fats Deeke as our resident playwright, and she started a playwriting career because of John Herbert giving us the royalties for Fortune and Men's Eyes. Another man who translated the Phaedo farces. He also allowed us to keep the royalties. We did a lot of work with that, just employing people, doing extra things. And there were a lot of people who were very kind to us on that.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you very much, Percy.